I think we should start. We're going to start this conversation, and I'm very excited because I have before me Dr. Felipe Hinojosa, who sought me out about a year ago and asked me to join him at Texas A&M, where he teaches, to talk about my book on the Young Lords. And in fact, that was one of the first book talks I gave, and Dr. Felipe Hinojosa was incredibly gracious. And it's only fitting that I would now, return the favor and explore your body of work, which is beautiful. But beyond our academic work, I was greeted above all by a human being. And I want to thank you for that, because I met you and it felt like you were my brother. Truly. No,
that's true. That's true.
That's true. We started talking up a storm, and it was beautiful. In any case, enough already about me and my experience with Dr. Felipe Hinojosa. I want to introduce him formally. Felipe Hinojosa received his PhD from the University of Houston in 2009. So, shout out to the University of Houston for producing such a stellar scholar. And he joined the faculty at Texas A&M that same year in 2009. His research areas include Chicano, Chicana, and Latino history and studies, American religion, race and ethnicity, and social movements. He serves as the director of the Carlos H. Cantu Hispanic Education and Opportunity Endowment at the university. Professor Hinojosa serves as editor for the interdisciplinary, peer-reviewed, and online moderated forum, Latinx Talk. His work has appeared in Zócalo, Public Square, Western Historical Quarterly, American Catholic Studies, Mennonite Quarterly Review, and in multiple edited collections on Latinx studies. He's already written a book. We're here to talk about his second book. His first book was titled Latino Mennonites, Civil Rights, Faith, and Evangelical Culture. And it was published by none other than Johns Hopkins University Press. And he published that in 2014. And it was awarded the 2015 Americo Paredes Book Award for the best book in Mexican American and Latino Studies by the Center for Mexican American Studies at South Texas College. His latest book, which is why we're here, is titled Apostles of Change, Latino Radical Politics, Church Occupations, and the Fight to Save the Barrio. And it is published by the University of Texas Press. It's in print, 2021. And it is set in 4 major cities, but we're going to talk about that. Okay, without further ado, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us. I'm all dressed up for the occasion. And I'm excited because we've been cooped up in the house, and now here we are, getting all dolled up. At least I am. I don't know about you, Professor Hinojosa, but I am, for this big event. Let's start. I'll start with a conversation we started yesterday. I conducted a lot of research in the 1990s for Dr. Manning Marable, who was always exploring poverty and racism in the United States as experienced by Black Americans, but also Latinos. And I was a graduate student. Dr. Manning Marable taught at Columbia, where I got my PhD, and he is the author of the Pulitzer Prize winning biography of Malcolm X. Whenever I did research, Brownsville, Texas came up alongside of the Bronx, where I grew up, as one of the poorest districts in the country. You grew up in Brownsville. Can
I
you
did.
talk to us about that experience of growing up in Brownsville? What did it mean to be a Latino kid in Brownsville, Texas?
So yeah, so first of all, just want to say thank you for doing this, for hosting this conversation, and I really do feel the same way in terms of that that connection and that love and that spirit that we felt almost immediately there at the airport in Austin, and during your time here in College Station. So thank you for this, and just to say that even as we're preparing for your visit to come to College Station. The conversations that we had leading up to it, talking about your book, everybody was excited. The students were excited. Students that had been in my classes and had heard me talk about the Young Lords had read your work and were all very excited about you coming. So it's really great to be on here with you for this. I will tell you that Brownsville, so geographically, Brownsville's on the southern tip of Texas, and La Mera Puntita at the very bottom, right on the Gulf Coast. We are a massive state. If you've ever been to Texas, I mean, it's from Brownsville to Dallas, Texas. It's a 10-hour drive, just to kind of give you an idea.
Wow.
It'll take an entire hour. When I went to school in Fresno, California, I used to drive my little truck from Brownsville to Fresno every August to get back to class. Just being in El Paso, still in my home state, I was halfway to Fresno, California already. And so just to kind of give you the enormity of that state. And the area and the region that I grew up in is a very historic region. The Rio Grande Valley, for a lot of reasons, has been contested territory ever since the U.S. War of Aggression against Mexico in 1846. It was that area and that zone just south of San Antonio, near Corpus Christi, where the Nueces River is, up to the Rio, down to the Rio Grande, that patch of land that was contested territory and really where that U.S. War of Aggression began. And it's always been, as one ethnographer calls it, a Tejano sort of cultural zone. So I grew up in Brownsville, yes, in deep poverty. My parents only got an elementary school education. My dad was born in Mexico, in Tamaulipas, San Fernando, Tamaulipas, in un ranchito. He came to the U.S. with his family. He was undocumented, came during World War II. My mom was born in Brownsville, and all of the raza, most of the raza, working class Mexicanos, lived in one sort of area of Brownsville around what's called the southmost area. And if you know Brownsville, you know La Southmost, le decían. And what's interesting about that whole area is that once you cross from the border town of Mexico, Matamoros, you come into the United States through one of the bridges. There's now like 3 bridges to come across in Brownsville. But back when I was growing up, there was one sort of main entry point. The first street you hit is called Elizabeth Street. That was named after
We lost you there for a minute. We're going to get him back. Everyone hang tight. We've lost our guest, Dr. Felipe Hinojosa. Some of what he said, he's left. Give us 1 second. He'll be right back with us. But here we are. He's connecting. Aha,
Okay.
lost you.
Okay. Sorry. I guess for whatever reason, I just sort of blanked out all of a sudden. The phone just sort of ended on me. I don't know why that happened. But anyway, like I was saying, you cross from Matamoros you cross the bridge from Matamoros into Brownsville. The first street is named Elizabeth Street, which was the name of the wife of Charles Stillman, a New York capitalist who had come to Brownsville to basically get rich, come out to, you know, that F word, what was known back then as that frontier, right? And so, but the next streets after Elizabeth streets are all named after U.S. presidents. Polk, Taylor, Tyler, Roosevelt. I lived on Taylor Street. And
but this territory was previously Mexican territory.
This was previously Mexican territory, absolutely.
So this is an example of the border crossing you.
Absolutely.
Not you crossing the border. Brownsville, which today is one of the poorest districts in the country.
Absolutely. And you think about the United States and that the city sort of putting its stamp on that border city by naming every street as you come in after a U.S. president.
Right.
And I could walk from my house on Taylor Street, I could walk to the bridge to go to Matamoros. It was about a 15-minute walk at the most.
Okay, so mentor us here and teach us, because there are a lot of folks here probably from the East Coast who don't really know the history of the Western territories and of Texas in particular. So when was Brownsville and this greater area that previously belonged to Mexico occupied essentially by the United States? What's the year we're talking about?
We're talking about the 1830s. We're talking about right after that battle of the Alamo, when it becomes a republic. But remember, it still remains, this is still territory that Mexico claims as its own. And the United States is claiming the border region as its own. Mexico is saying that the border is at the Nueces River around Corpus Christi, where Selena Quintanilla is from. The United States government in DC is saying, no, it's on the Rio Grande, and that's where it is. And that area, that zone there, is what remains contested and where the war of aggression really sort of begins. President Polk, James K. Polk, famously says at one point there that when there's a skirmish and some Mexican soldiers kill some U.S. soldiers, that U.S. Blood had been shed on American soil when he went to Congress. And that kicks off the war. That's in that contested zone and area where I'm from and where I grew up.
Wait, you mentioned Selena Quintanilla. Wait, what is he talking about? I don't understand. I didn't hear anything else after that.
Well, I just wanted to give people a reference point.
Can you tell us what Selena Quintanilla meant to you, and were you aware of her music when you were growing up?
Of course. I was in high school. We had a jukebox at Simon Rivera High School. That was the name of my high school, Simon Rivera High School. We had a jukebox, and during lunch, you know, you could play some music, and the most popular music was, without question, Tejano. Tejano music in the 90s was the shit. It was it.
Right.
And
so what was your favorite Selena song?
I mean, I loved all of them. I think, you know, I'm not going to attempt to try to sing any of them. But the really,
Chitty bum bum. Chitty bum bum. Okay, go
ahead.
Tell me which one.
Selena, what she did is she confirmed us. She made us seem like nobody cared about Tejano music. It's that oompa sound, that polka, you know, accordion and bajo sexto sound. Selena took us next level and got us with the Mark Anthony's of the world and the music scene in New York City, connected what we were doing in little South Texas with the broader world. And it was incredible. That's why she's our queen. She's everybody's queen. You know what I mean?
She said, you know, South Texas is here, stand up.
Exactly. Exactly. When nobody had seen us before, nobody really liked the Wranglers and the cowboy boots and the cowboy hats. And I went in Brownsville. Brownsville, the border region is a lot like when you grow up in a city where, as a person of color, you're in the majority. I compare it to what, you know, when I would meet my colleagues from Atlanta when I was there for a year, what they would talk about Atlanta as a black city, as a chocolate city. For me and for us, the valley, South Texas, the Rio Grande Valley, is that cultural zone where you grow up in that social safety net, right? Where you're valued.
It was a Mexican town, essentially.
It was a Mexican town. But when you live in those
places. Were there
places,
other ethnicities there? Or was it purely Mexican?
I mean, it was 90% Chicano.
Right.
90%. And when you live in those cultural zones, you know, you have the goth kids, you've got the punk rockers, you've got the heavy metal bangers, you've got the cowboys, you've got everybody.
All of them are Mexican?
All of them are Mexican.
They're Mexican heavy metal kids?
Absolutely. We grew up with all
What?
kinds of, yeah, absolutely. Judas Priest, Metallica.
Oh, all right. I didn't know. I didn't know this. Okay.
And
So,
in my high school, I'll just tell you this, in my high school, there were probably 2,000 students.
wow.
You know, probably about 5 white kids and
Right.
maybe about 3 or 4 African American kids.
Wow.
And everybody else was raza. And you had the Ralph Lauren polo raza, and then you had the, you know, the Tejano kids with the boots and all that. And then you had somebody like me. I was a football player. I was
What? I thought you were the
yeah.
nerd. You were the cool football player.
No, I was not the nerd at all. If you talk to anybody that knew me in high school, they will tell you, how in the hell did you become a
A
professor at a
professor.
university?
Oh my goodness. Okay, wait. So, who were your parents? Talk to us about who are your parents?
Yes. My my parents, Conrado and Esther. My mom's first name is actually Ventura, but she went by her middle name, Esther. And they were, my dad was an immigrant, came to the U.S., as I mentioned, in the 1940s with his family. And he was about 6 years old at the time. My mother was born in Brownsville. My grandfather was a Methodista, from the very beginning, with one of the most historic Mexican Methodist churches in South Texas, Iglesia El Buen Pastor, Iglesia Metodista El Buen Pastor. He was the janitor. He would clean the church. So my mother grew up very religious, in a very, very religious home, Protestant. Very religious Protestant home. My dad was Catholic, but nominal. My dad loved to drink, dance, and party, have a good time. And my mom was very religious. They were just polar opposites.
A
And
man of the world.
yeah, and when they got married, my dad would work in we're a port city, so we're right on the Gulf Coast. My dad worked in the shrimping industry there, and my mom's side of the family were migrant farm workers. And so they would go to Michigan, and they would go to Ohio, Indiana, and they would pick tomatoes in Ohio. They would pick cherries in Traverse City, Michigan. And then on the way back, if it was safe, because my grandfather knew the roads, and there was sort of a map of Mexicano families from South Texas that would make it to the Midwest. If it was safe, they would stop and pick cotton in Missouri before coming back home.
Wow. So your mother's people were part of this transnational
Yeah,
class of people who worked in plantations.
exactly.
They came from the Caribbean, from Mexico, and from other parts of Latin America, and they picked cotton, and they also grew agricultural goods.
Absolutely. And my mother's family, a lot of them,
Vegetables. Mm-hmm.
because Brownsville was, a lot of my uncles on my mother's maiden name is Tijerina. And so a lot of the Tijerinas were malillos, like we used to call them. It was just not, they were just not in good company for the most part in their
What
lives.
are malillos?
Malillos, just gente que no tenía ningún rumbo. They were just not, I mean, my uncles were drinking and smoking and maybe going to work here and there, but for the most part, there was a sense that they were not going to, if they stayed in Brownsville, their lives were not going to go anywhere. And so they migrated out, like many Tejano families did. And so they're part of the Tejano diaspora in northwestern Ohio. There are a lot of Tejanos up there. And my family, my Tijerina family, settled out. And I have a lot of cousins that grew up in Ohio instead of Brownsville.
We have a question here. How long is the trip from Texas to Ohio?
Oh, it's 30 hours at least. And that's talking about in a modern vehicle today. Back then, era una camioneta. It was a truck, era una troca. And so it would take even longer than that. And they would pack it to the brim, because you're talking about taking all of your supplies, pots and pans, todo para cocinar. They were stopping alongside of the road to cook in the rest areas. La cosa que decía mi madre, mi abuelita Manuela, which was my mother's mother, mi abuela materna, she was a woman of dignity. She carried herself very well. And even in the fields, what mattered most to her was un mantel. If you were going to eat, if you were going to sit, it didn't matter what rest area or what field you were working at. she preparaba la área para cenar o para comer y ponía un mantel, a tablecloth, right?
Right.
And I love that. And
The
I
dignity
love that. The dignity, yeah.
Of eating with dignity and bringing people together with food. My friend Patricia Thomas, with whom I grew up here in New York City, she now lives in Utah. She says that the word you use, what was it again?
Mantel?
No.
Oh.
The bad guys. What is it called?
Los malíos.
Los malidos.
Malíos.
Malíos.
Yeah.
Los malíos. She likened that word malíos to a word we use, which is maleantes. Los maleantes.
Okay. Yeah.
So, okay, before we move on to like how you got to college, I just want to say to our listening audience that your parents and your father, clearly, who migrated during World War II, but also your mother's people who worked in the plantations across the country, form part of a class of Latinos and other people of color, like Black Americans and Puerto Ricans, but also Native Americans, who migrated to the cities during and after World War II en masse. So Mexicans from the Southwest and from Mexico, Puerto Ricans from Puerto Rico, African Americans from the South in this period are migrating to cities, and they are becoming part of the working class. Previously rural people and plantation workers, and now because there are openings in the cities, job openings because of the war, they are going from countryside to city. And this is important because in this process of people of color, rural people becoming workers and living in the cities, they gain enormous amount of power economically and politically. And that forms the foundation of the coming civil rights movement, which doesn't only involve Black Americans, but involves Latinos.
Absolutely.
And Native Americans and Asians.
Absolutely.
So tell us, okay, so you grew up in Brownsville. Your parents were working class people. Your father, however, was a minister or became a minister. He was a malillo or in the malillo family.
He was estaba en ese, like the evangélicos say, estaba en el mundo, hermana. Estaba en el mundo.
Yeah, del mundo, a man of the world, and he became a minister. And what's fascinating, I don't want to offend anybody, but this is also the religion of the colonizers, the Methodist Church.
Yeah.
So how did your father become a minister, and why, after like being a man of the world?
Well, let me tell you, it happened.
He drank, era mujeriego, and then he ended up with God.
Johanna, mi mamá le planchaba la ropa para que fuera a bailar, mi papá.
No.
Yes.
Are you listening to this, guys? Listen. Welcome to our Latino culture. Latinx, excuse me.
Exactly.
Sígueme diciendo, por favor.
Así que tenía que, they were in the migrant field, so I go back and forth.
Okay, so the last thing you said was that your mother was ironing your father's clothes so he could go out to the club.
Yeah, that's what mom did. And mom se quedaba en la casa. I have 6 siblings. I'm the youngest of 7, okay?
We lost you again? The story was just getting good. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, are you there? Okay, mira. So in Ohio, my parents worked for the Mennonites. The Mennonites are these German ethnic people that have these big farms. They're growing tomatoes. My parents worked for them because my abuela materna liked that those Mennonites gave them Sunday off, that they took the Sabbath. They respected the Sabbath. Seriously. So they did that. And they had these little servicios evangélicos. As many Pentecostés, a lot of these people that were on the migrant trail were evangelicals. They were Pentecostals. They were Catholics. And they would have mass out in the fields, or they would, in a makeshift barn, they would recreate church. And it's in those places that my dad, because there was nowhere else to go. You were in the labor camp. And yeah, there was a baile here and then, maybe on the weekends, but it wasn't as...
You were in jail.
You were, hey, exactly.
You were in worker jail.
So the way my dad tells it is that una vez he took my mother to church. It was very cold in Ohio. And instead of staying in the car, he goes inside to stay warm. And when he goes inside, the pastor hace la invitación, come, quien quiere aceptar a Jesucristo como su Salvador. And my dad goes up to accept Jesus Christ as a Savior. He does. He feels this calling to go back to his people to minister.
So this was like a camp meeting.
Yeah,
like a religious camp meeting.
Right.
And this has a long history in the United States.
Yeah.
In the middle of nowhere camp meetings where you find God, where you speak to God directly.
And these are all migrant workers, mind you, from all over the United States, mostly from the South.
So people got converted in part through labor.
Yeah, exactly.
Because it was the Mennonites who were running some of these plantations.
They had these large farms and plantations, yes, so they would work. And a lot of these Mennonites...
Are you guys listening to this? Sígueme diciendo, por favor.
These Mennonites were also, some of them spoke Spanish because they had been missionaries in South America. So when they're on furlough in Ohio, they hold these camp meetings for the workers.
Wow.
Y ahí pasó.
Can I just tell something to my listening audience, all 18 of you who are here? The Methodist Church in the 19th century was contracted out by the federal government to civilize Native Americans. During the westward expansion, the Methodists were the folks who were sent out into the frontier states to where Native Americans lived, and they were put in charge of building the Indian schools, the Native American schools, whose job was to strip Native Americans of children, of their identity, of their names, of their values, the notion that private property is not a thing for Native Americans. No one owns the land. The land is owned collectively. Those are the values of Native Americans. So they had to be stripped of those values. Yeah, so I just want to put that out there.
My family's
one of the churches that the Young Lords occupied
was Methodist.
What comes from the, not just Methodist, but comes from that lineage of churches that colonized Puerto Rico and eviscerated or attempted to eviscerate the culture of Native Americans and strip Native American children of their Native American values and identities. Were you going to say something? I'm
just confirming everything you're talking about. And I think what's fascinating,
because by the way, he's the religion specialist, not me. But I happen to teach the 20th century.
Right now you're preaching, and I love it because this is exactly it. I think it's what people sometimes bypass when we're talking about colonialism, settler colonialism. Religion, it's just sort of assumed it's one thing, but the story of those workers, the story of people like my parents who took that in, and then my dad says, me quiero ir a Brownsville. I want to go back to Brownsville to preach to my people. And my mom says, hold the phone. If we go back, you're going to go back to esa vida, okay? And my mom keeps them in Ohio for 5 years. They work, they settle out, and they live there.
Your mother knew. Your mother was like, no, this man needs to convert here, become a minister, because if he goes back, va a seguir going, yes.
Mujería, yeah, exactly. No, te puedo platicar las historias que me ha platicado mi madre, the stories that my mother has told me to this day. And it's
so he became a minister up in the camp meetings, up in the middle of nowhere?
In Ohio. In Ohio.
Wow. So he became a minister. Okay, so your mother knew what she was doing. Let me get
She knew what she was doing. She knew what she was doing. She kept him on lock for 5 years. After that, she's convinced that he's good. They come back to Brownsville. My dad goes to that area, La Southmost, where one of my tíos, mi tío Lalo, lived. And my dad starts to talk to him about what happened, his changes, all of that. Mi tío Lalo converts and eventually says, aquí tengo mi garaje, my garage. You can use this to start having church here. So that's where my dad starts his first church, is in my Tío Lalo's garage in Brownsville,
His
right off
camp
of South
meeting
North.
in the garage.
Yeah. So this is this is about 68, 69.
That's a beautiful story. And so what's fascinating is that the subject of your first book is what?
Latinos and African Americans, and the way that and their collaborations in the Mennonite Church. So I look at that church because that church, the Mennonites, for those of you that don't know too much about them, they're a peace church. They're very much part of that non-resistant tradition. They don't believe in military service. They refuse it. They were conscientious objectors during World War II. They resisted the draft. Very sort of progressive church, but heavily white and heavily German ethnic. And but they also had a part of them that was that proselytized, that evangelized in major cities. Chicago. They were in Ay Bonito. They were on the island in Puerto Rico. They had a hospital there, El Hospital Menonita in Ay Bonito.
So I want to just clarify with our listening audience that it wasn't the Mennonites who were contracted by the American government to convert the Native Americans. It was not.
No.
And this story is making sense because your father, who's a man of the world,
yeah,
he couldn't get down with the Catholics probably,
no.
or with the Methodists. So he chose the peace-loving religion that's
right.
pretty open in its orientation and perspective.
When dad does that, when dad and mom do that, their worlds open completely, because all of a sudden they're meeting Puerto Ricans from East Harlem, they're meeting African Americans from St. Louis, and they're meeting other Latinos from the Midwest and Florida and the Northeast. This little world in Brownsville, which was heavily Mexican, when they joined this church, expands their possibilities. And so growing up as a kid, I met these people. They would come and visit dad and mom, these families.
Oh, wow.
Dominican Mennonites, Puerto Rican Mennonites, African Americans, they would come down to Brownsville. We would go and visit them, that sort of thing. And I remember being in graduate school and asking my dad, what was that all of, like, what was that story? What did you all do? And he starts telling me the movement that they organized, which was basically this sort of interethnic what they called the Minority Ministries Council, very much in the spirit of James Foreman and the Black Manifesto, which was calling on white churches to give up $500 million to white churches and Jewish communities that had also benefited from the establishment of slavery. And so that world, that group that was formed, dad and mom weren't a part of it. They were still in Brownsville, but they were friends with all of those people that were a part of it. And when I'm in graduate school looking for a topic, I took a class called Comparative Race and Ethnicity. And everybody's, it was the early 2000s. So we were talking about the relational turn in Chicano history, right? That we're not just looking at these sort of siloed vertical relationships with white Americans, but we're looking at our relationships with African Americans, with Puerto Ricans, Asian Americans, Native folk. And I knew that dad had known about this group, this multi-ethnic group in the 60s. And I ended up writing a book about it.
Okay, so this is important because the civil rights movement has a profound impact on every area of life, including religion. And so this multi-ethnic, interethnic group within the church of people of color is forcing the Mennonite church to integrate itself.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So essentially your parents through the church must have become politicized. That's what you're saying.
They were, and this is part of in my title where I talk about evangelical culture. This is that part of the kinds of folk that I grew up with that were very evangelicos, and they proselytized. I mean, my dad would meet with people and share with them el plan de salvación. But at the same time, the plan of salvation. But at the same time, would speak against the Iraq War in the 90s, would make sure that none of the kids in our church were going to the military, or would give us options and present us with different ways of being. We did service, not somewhere else. We were Chicano kids. We didn't have money to go anywhere else. We did service in our barrios, in our communities, painting, sheetrocking when we were in high school, helping our local neighbors. And with that came a lot of these white Mennonite liberals that would come down and do service. And a lot of them, Mennonites, they build things. And so a lot of them work, these contractor guys and all that. And so we would go out in the summers and work in our neighborhood and work in our community. So that's we were a sanctuary church in the 80s and 90s.
What did it mean to be a sanctuary church? A sanctuary church for what?
It meant that we opened our doors to Central American refugees that were fleeing war and violence at the hands of our government in Central America, and were coming to the United States, and the Reagan administration was not allowing them or providing them with asylum. They were seeing them as economic immigrants and not as people fleeing violence.
People from Nicaragua and Central and South America, because
exactly.
The United States had literally launched terrorist counter-revolutionary movements supported in Latin America, who would fight the revolutionary movements that were homegrown in Latin America during that period.
So when I'm in graduate school, when people talk about religion, it was always in a negative sense. And I grew up thinking, nobody's writing about the kinds of communities that I saw growing up, the kinds of raza that kind of walked these borders, that were very sort of evangelical on one hand, or very católico, but were committed to social justice. And I remember being in workshops, and I at the University of Houston, I got to meet a lot of really great people that at the time were writing their dissertations, historians, Chicano historians like John McKiernan Gonzalez, Rudy Guevara, Lilia Fernández, a lot of other, Ana Rosas, a lot of other people that came through UH. And I remember being in those workshops, and religion, nobody was talking about religion. I was always the outcast. And whenever I would bring up religion, I kid you not, people would say, well, then go and write that book.
Right. Wow.
Like, don't tell us, go and write that book. And so that's what I did.
Okay. So how did you decide? And so the title of the book on the Mennonites that you wrote, can you give it to us?
Civil Rights, Faith, and Evangelical Culture.
Why did you decide? You were a kid from Brownsville. Your parents didn't go to college.
Didn't even go to high school.
They didn't go to high school. Nor did my parents, right? We come from this generation of kids who became professors.
Yeah.
Why did you decide to go to graduate school? And did you even know what that was?
No, of course not. Of course not. And, I remember graduating from college, which, by the way, when I was accepted at Fresno Pacific University in 1997, I was accepted on academic probation because I had a 1-point-something GPA. And when I wanted to be an English major, because I've always loved to read, the counselor was like, you're not going to make it. Why don't you pick an easier major? I mean, literally told me this. And con más ganas, orale, tell me I'm not going to do it. Orale, let's do it. I'm on. So I majored in English. I became a great student at Fresno Pacific because for the first time I was in what I needed was attention. I needed a faculty member that was going to make sure like, hey, you all right? Like, you doing okay? And I had that. And I was reading John Muir, Terry Tempest Williams, Edward Abbey, Gloria Saldúa, and just mira. And I became a nerd. And
so where did you study? Where did you go to college again?
I went to Fresno Pacific University.
Okay. Okay. So you became, what did the professor say you should become, or the teacher? Not English. What did he suggest that you should study?
He didn't suggest anything for me. He just said English was really difficult.
That you weren't going to cut the mustard. Okay.
No, I wasn't going to make it.
So you showed him. Or
yeah. No, I did. And believe me, it wasn't easy. But I had that chip on my shoulder, and I still have that chip. But that. Wait, everybody,
I read one of his chapters in his new brilliant book, Apostles of Change. This man knows how to write. That's all I got to say. That's all I got to say. And I was an English major too, by the way. You know why I think you were
Really?
English majors? Because Spanish is probably your first language, or Spanish was my first language. And I always had a chip on my shoulder that I couldn't really speak English properly. And so I majored in English.
I didn't know this. I didn't know this about you, but that's
my parents still don't speak English. Go ahead.
Well, that's the very same reason why I did it, because I was like, I need to learn this language and speak it well. And I remember anyway, I got into a lot of problems in grammar class, but subject verb agreement, you know, it was never there.
I don't even know. I don't know any of those. Like, I can write now, but I don't know any of that. Like, no, I don't. I'll write it.
So I graduate from college and I go and I work for a nonprofit. I had gotten into anti-racism education. In college, I was an agitator on campus. And, you know, we were in the middle of Fresno.
An agitator?
Well, we were in Southeast Fresno at this private college. It was a Mennonite college.
You were raising hell?
Yeah, I was raising hell. I was walking into the president's office. And, you know, Raza from California in the Central Valley would tell me, you know, you're talking this big game because you're from Texas. You know, it's different in Central California. In Central California, Professor, they have worker towns and grower towns, okay? The raza that I met were from these worker towns that had gotten, you know, that were really brilliant kids, were working hard. They got in, they got their scholarships, and they did their thing. But they were like, look, I'm going to get my degree from this institution, and then I'm out. And I was like, nah.
They were upwardly mobile.
Yeah, they were upper.
Yeah, very working, but very working class.
Very working class.
We need to come here and do what we're going to do and, you know, rise up the ranks.
I'm coming from Brownsville. Raza in Brownsville is everywhere. Superintendents, we're the teachers. We got Selena on the radio. We got Emilio Navaira on the jukebox. You know, I mean, come on.
That's fascinating.
I'm going to get to Fresno and I'm going to be like, that's not the way I'm going to roll. I end up finishing there and I work for a nonprofit that does anti-racism education in Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. So here I am, a 22-year-old kid, all right, in Macon, Mississippi, Philadelphia, Mississippi, all right, New Orleans. I'm in all of these places, and I don't know a damn thing. I don't know anything about my history, about my people, and I'm there talking to African-American youth younger than me, maybe 17 or 18, because we would sponsor these programs for African-American youth. And I would go and hang out with them and visit, tell me what you guys are doing for the community, that sort of thing. And I remember one instance very clearly where one of the kids tells me, you know, the whites go to the pool on these days and the blacks go to the pool on these days. And I'm like, what? Wait, what?
What? This is
what
in the 2000s?
Exactly. Yeah, this is in the 2000s. This is 2000, 2001. Okay. It changes everything. I'm living now in Edinburgh, Texas, in South Texas. I'm back home. I'm about an hour away from Brownsville. When I'm seeing this and experiencing this, I'm like, I got to go back to school. I got to get a master's degree. If for nothing else, I thought I'm going to teach history because at that point I wanted to teach history. I was sort of, you know, I didn't want to do English anymore. And I was like, if I get a master's, I can coach football and teach history and make a little bit more money with a master's degree. I get to UT Pan American in Edinburgh and I sign up for a master's in history, and the rest is history, because when I'm in there.
Right. And you fell in love.
I fell in love. I was in that seminar room. We're talking about Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. And I'm like, this is it. This is where I want to be. I don't want to go anywhere else. And the faculty there were like, look, if you want to go to get your PhD, which we think you should, consider the University of Houston. And that's all I did. I didn't want to go anywhere. I didn't have dreams of like 10-year track, que este que el otro. It was all, I'm going to UH, I'm going to be an activist, and I'm going to barbecue every weekend, and I'm going to raise babies, and I'm going to teach 8 classes, whatever it is, and that's going to be my life. And it just, yeah. I didn't know anybody that had a PhD. I didn't know what the University of Houston was. I didn't know the history of Mexican Americans. You
were in a master's program.
Yeah, this was 2002 to 2004.
So you were gonna like teach community college with a master's program and race-based.
Maybe, but my goal was to coach football and teach high school.
Right. And so, but then you got into a PhD program. Then you continued.
Then I continued. There I met Luis Alvarez. I met Raul Ramos, who are prominent Chicano historians. Lupe San Miguel was my advisor. He does education. And, you know, they affirmed what I wanted to do. And they saw something in me for whatever reason. And I just didn't stop. I just kept going. And really, it was fun. You know, I mean, it was work and it was hard and we struggled and we were poor and all of that. And no teníamos nada and very little funding. And Maribel, my partner, was also trying to kind of climb the ladder and kind of get her thing. But, you know, we did it. We had babies at that time. You know, the kids were young. They were being born.
So what would you tell young people from our backgrounds, right? Our parents didn't go to school.
I'm going to turn on this light.
There, gracias, mijo, porque now we can see you. What would you tell young people who come from our working class backgrounds who want to go to graduate school and get a PhD? Like, I didn't even know what that, I got into a PhD program and I didn't really know what that was.
I didn't know either. And I didn't know that, you know, now I'm meeting colleagues that had it all planned out. They wanted to go to Stanford or they were going to go to some big school and they were going to line up this and work with this scholar. I didn't even know who to work with. I mean,
you didn't even know that you had to work with someone.
I didn't even know that I had to work with somebody. And then I met Lupe San Miguel and Luis Alvarez came to the Valley, came to South Texas to recruit us. They took us to go eat tacos in Reynosa on the Mexican side. And I was like, this is it. This is what I want. I want to be in a program like this. And I met some incredible people. I was a part of a really brilliant cohort that I'm very proud of. A lot of us have done really good work and have published. And I made friends that'll last for a lifetime there. But it wasn't anything that I planned or really sort of thought about clearly. I was just sort of kind of stumbling my way through it. I mean, I wrote a book about Latinos in the Mennonite church. Like nobody does that. I mean, you know, like who writes about Mennonites?
How has Maribel's how has Maribel influenced your trajectory?
Well, without Maribel, none of this happens because she was able to, she's a licensed psychologist. She's also a PhD. So she, when we got married, had just finished her master's in marriage and family therapy. And so when she finishes, you know, she's able to at least line up some work. And I had gotten grants and fellowships, and I was very lucky in that regard. And not because I knew of anything, but because people were pulling me aside and saying, you should probably apply to that thing. But Maribel was able to provide some economic kind of stability in the home.
Maribel is your partner.
Maribel is my partner.
Your
yeah,
wife.
We've been married. My wife. We've been married 20 years.
Wow. Okay. So you didn't answer the question. What advice would you give young people? Focus, professor. Focus.
It's so hard. It's so hard. I mean, you know, I go back and forth between telling people do what you love and pursue your dreams, but just be cognizant that this thing is not, I mean, it's hard. This thing is not easy and there's no guarantees. And the job market is horrible. And there's all kinds of things that could go wrong. But I just, every step along the way, felt that what I was doing was where I needed to be regardless. And that's what I ask when people want to work with me, when they ask me, like, if they want to, you know, if I could be their advisor and all that, I always ask them, why is it that you're doing this? And if there's a love, if there's a passion, if they're even pursuing kind of a you know, something that's even biographical, which many of us do, you know, we tend to write about, you know, what we tend to write about what it is that we know and what we love. And so, you know, it's like that is what I would, you know, recommend and kind of give advice to everybody is just make sure that what it is that you're doing is brings you joy and brings you love, and that you have a passion for it. That sounds corny and all that. Pues, ¿qué quieres que te diga?
So, you know, you got to be one with your soul in terms of what you do. I hear you.
You do, because if not, then you're not going to do the work. You're not going to want to do the work. You're not, I mean, all of that goes
and it's hard. And you know what? If I had known what a PhD meant, I wouldn't have done it. Sometimes it's better not to know.
Exactly.
I would have been like, ooh, I can't do that. But, you know, you just have to put one foot in front of the other in this process. Okay, listen, we have everybody. My listening audience, are you with us? This is going to shut down in 2 minutes, but we're going to come back on again. Okay, that's what we're going to do. We're going to come back on when this shuts down, because now we're going to talk about the brilliant book that this man has written. But let's start, because we have like 5 minutes.
Okay.
Tell us about, let me ask you a question, Dr. Felipe Hinojosa. What is the major argument of your book?
Oh my God. The major argument is this.
I'm going to put you, you know, come on. Let me see. Let me hear
it. The idea that radical movements, radical politics, like those practiced by Católicos por la Raza, the Young Lords, the Mexican American Youth Organization, opened pathways, opened possibilities for church and religious reformers inside of evangelical churches. They don't get any credit for that. The Young Lords don't get any credit from religious institutions. And people say, well, Latinos were already, religious Latino communities were already fighting for their rights with Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. Yeah, but nobody gave a fuck, to be honest. Nobody cared. White people were not listening to them. The urban crisis was black and white, and nobody was listening to Latinos. It's not until James Foreman brings Obed Lopez from LADO, from the Latin American Defense Organization in Chicago, and puts him on stage at the Presbyterian Conference in San Antonio, and says, if you're going to, and tells the white audience, if you're going to deal with racism, and if we're going to, you know, transform this society, you've got to listen to Black Americans, and you've got to listen to Spanish-speaking Americans.
Who's James Foreman? People might not know James Foreman, Dr. Hinojosa.
James Foreman was former leader of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
One of the major organizations of the civil rights movement of the 60s. Go ahead.
Major organization. He goes on from there and starts to work and develop with, I think, what's called the Black Economic Development Council in 68 or 69. And he's most known for, at least in religious studies circles, for this Black manifesto that he pens and that he writes, which was basically demanding $500 million from church institutions. And him and his followers begin to occupy church offices in New York City and all over the place, really. But, excuse me, it's this huge call to pay reparations.
And part of what these activists, Black Power activists, are doing is exposing the ways in which churches across the country, the Methodist Church, the Presbyterian Church, how they collaborated with the extermination of Native Americans, but also with the institution of slavery, and how they were benefiting in the 1960s from exploitation, capitalist exploitation and oppression.
Yeah.
So
that's the main argument of the book. It basically, what I document is that these church occupations changed the game for Latino and Latina religious reformers. And
that allowed Latinos to actually become part of the hierarchy.
They did.
At top echelons of the church.
They couldn't ignore them anymore. They couldn't ignore them anymore because they learned that there were large populations of Latinos in urban communities that were fighting alongside and organizing alongside African Americans.
So who were the people who occupied? Just give us a little more. We've got 2 minutes. By the way, everybody who's here, this is an incredible contribution you're making to the literature. And I saw this when I was writing my book on the Young Lords. that this, what you're saying, was happening. So we want you guys in 2 minutes to come back on, but we're going to finish this out right now.
Yeah.
So everybody, please rejoin us so that we can conclude our conversation. So who were the people who were occupying these churches, and why were they occupying them?
The Young Lords in Chicago. People
Who are
like
the Young Lords?
Jose Chacha Jimenez. The Young Lords in Chicago, at least, which is where they originate, was a former street gang turned political organizing group in the area of Chicago known as Lincoln Park. And that area was...
And they're Puerto Ricans and Mexicans.
And they're Puerto Ricans and Mexicans, exactly. And they were collaborating with this, what begins to develop as the Rainbow Coalition. Fred Hampton in Chicago, other African-American leaders, and the white group, the
Young Patriots.
The Young Patriots. Yeah, exactly. And you have people that are growing up in these neighborhoods.
Okay, we're joined again here. This is a conversation with Dr. Felipe Hinojosa. He's standing by and he's talking to us about the thesis of his new book, Apostles of Change. Here he is. There you are. I'm gonna chug it too.
By the way, can I just say, you're really good at this. You're keeping me on track.
Hang out with me, professor. Hang out with me.
You're keeping me on track here because I'm going all over the place. And you're like, vente, get back.
Get back. Answer the question. No, you did really well. Listen. Okay, everybody who's joining, the ultimate question, y'all didn't get it because y'all are not professors. Maybe some of you are. The ultimate question is, what is the major argument of your book? And you answered it brilliantly, Professor. Doctor Hinojosa. That was brilliant. I loved it.
Well, thank you.
No, but it was in one sentence.
It's also, as you know, for you, it's like years in the making, you know,
right.
Like that moment is years in the making.
Yeah, no,
and
absolutely.
I don't, by the way, like I don't, and I think you do this as well. Like, I think picking, when I think about what I want to write about or my projects and all of that, I'm driven by an idea. I'm driven by a story. I'm driven by something that I fall in love with. The thesis will come
later.
Historiography, I don't care if there's a gap or not in the literature, whatever. Right. There's a great story here and I want to tell it.
Beautiful. And you told it beautiful. The part of the book I read, you told it phenomenally.
Thank you.
Okay, so you were telling us about the different groups that occupy churches, the different Latino groups that occupy churches. You started with the Young Lords in Chicago, who were Puerto Rican and Mexican revolutionaries, self-proclaimed. What were the other groups, Latino groups, that occupy churches? And
so the other is Católicos por la Raza, and that's in LA. Around the same time that the New York Young Lords are occupying the First Spanish Methodist United Methodist Church. Católicos did not occupy, but they disrupted Christmas Eve Mass in December, Christmas Eve, right? December 24th, 1969. And let me just tell you so many great stories, but I remember, so originally this was going to be a book about this narrative arc. I did it wrong in the beginning, right? The idea was that you could draw this narrative arc between occupation and sanctuary from the late 60s to the 1980s, right? And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to connect people who were part of these occupations and then follow their trajectory to then immigrant rights, okay? And I think there's something there. I think it's there. There's a lot more work to be done.
Later on.
Later on.
Right.
Yeah. When I first started, I wanted to go and meet Lidia Lopez, who was an organizer, the one-time president of the United Neighborhood Organization in Los Angeles. This was an organization that was modeled after Saul Alinsky, off of the Alinsky model. They organized people in East LA to lower auto insurance rates, to get more resources to their neighborhoods and to their areas. And Lydia was the president of this organization, and then she becomes a central figure in the LA sanctuary movement in the 1980s. So I go meet Lydia in her, she lives in a nursing home in Alhambra, California.
Oh, wow.
And I go and meet Lydia because I want to talk to her about her work in the late 70s and early 80s. I had no clue that she was there at St. Basil's Catholic Church on the night of December 24th, 1969. So when we sit down, and here I am, I mean, mira, I dressed up, whatever. I wanted to be as professional as I could with Lydia. And I sit down and will tell me about your work with UNO and all that. And she goes back.
Around immigrants' rights.
Yeah, around immigrants' rights. And she said, I mean, I'm paraphrasing right now, but basically it starts with Católicos por la Raza. I was there in 1969. And you can hear me in the tape even go like, okay, well.
Because you hadn't done your homework, clearly.
No, okay.
I'm just saying, you got to do the homework.
I didn't do the homework porque yo pensaba que whatever, I'll show up, it'll be great, whatever.
Right, and I just look good. I'm going to look the part. I'm going to wear my little suit, my white shirt, and my little corbata, and I'm going to be good. And I'm going to say, usted y tenga, and I'm going to be respectful.
Exactly.
And yeah, that's all I need. No,
and
by the way, those of you who are listening, when you're doing oral histories,
do your homework.
The thing is that you're supposed to do something like 7 hours of research for every 1 hour you spend talking to your subject. So Dr. Hinojosa here didn't do this 7 hours of research. Pero sigue.
Understand that I find Lydia in the archives at Wayne State University in Detroit. I didn't even know who Lydia was. Okay.
Oh, wow.
And I find her and I'm like, who is Lydia Lopez? And I start, Googling and trying to find out. And then I find out, see a couple of references in books, and I contact the authors just out of the blue, even people I didn't know. I'm like, you've written about Lydia. Is there any way you could help me connect me with her? I did. I called her from Detroit. And organized the interview and flew out to LA like probably a month later. I kid you not. I get there, I do it, and we start with Católicos, and that changes the whole trajectory of the book because Lydia's story is so phenomenal. She was the daughter of a Baptist preacher. She wasn't even Catholic.
Oh, wow.
And her entrance into the Chicano movement is through Católicos por la Raza and the events of that night and what happened.
So are Católicos por la Raza literally Catholics who are protesting in the Catholic Church?
Yes, but they were not all Catholic.
Pero se colaron algunos metodistas.
They were nominal Catholics for the most part. They were Chicano Brown Berets. They were Chicana welfare rights workers. They were a who's who of LA activists that formed Católicos.
And what was the demand of Católicos por la Raza in 1969 when they disrupted Christmas Mass?
Everything that James Foreman and Obed Lopez and Chacha Jimenez were asking for in Chicago. As a matter of fact, when they're organizing in LA, they were watching what had happened in Chicago. They were watching James Foreman, and they said, if we can just tweak the language for the Catholic Church, we can do what they did, but we won't occupy. We're going to have, the idea was to have mass outside. They didn't even think about disrupting it. That wasn't part of the plan.
But that's what ended up happening.
That's what ended up happening because the cardinal locked them out. After they had the tortilla mass outside of the Catholic Church.
That's what they called it. They called it the tortilla mass. So we're going to have a tortilla mass here.
They had that outside.
To show that we're slaves.
The cardinal locks the door and doesn't let them in.
And then they try to get in. But
and then they try to get in. And the cardinal knew that they were going to be there. He didn't know that they were going to try to get in. But what he did is he had undercover police officers serving as ushers inside of the Catholic Church.
As happened with the First Spanish United Methodist Church.
Exactly.
With the Young Lords.
The parallels, I mean, were right you know, and as
and you're
soon,
writing about this in this book. Everybody has to purchase this incredible book, and he's giving away the book for half price with a 40% off code or 10% off code or 30% off code. So maybe you can put that in the comments right now. But my question for you is, what are the demands? These are radicals, Latino radicals, who are organizing in LA. They're disrupting church services. And this is happening across the country in Chicago, New York, and other cities. Interestingly enough, Latinos are so religious that the radicals among us decide, well, where are we going to protest? The church.
exactly.
That's hilarious. What did they demand?
They demanded to use Catholic facilities to hold cultural events. They demanded that priests and nuns would be given permission to support farm workers, because Cardinal McIntyre was one of the most conservative cardinals in the country. They demanded healthcare. They demanded more funding for Catholic schools where a lot of Mexican American kids were attending.
Right.
So it was that sort of, it was in the vein of a lot of those demands. I think there were probably about 13 demands that they probably had. Professor, it's an incredible story. Some of the best archival finds came out of the stuff that the work that I did in LA. And I think the reason why Católicos has been sort of ignored for the most part, not completely, I mean, people have written about Católicos, is that it was a quick, I mean, you're talking about it coming together in the summer of '69, and by spring of '70, it starts to fade. But it fades because it was never an organization that was rooted inside of the church. It was always an organization made up of activists from across LA. And so at the very forefront of what's going on in LA is the anti-war movement. So in 1970, which this year we're celebrating the 50th anniversary, or not celebrating, but commemorating, right? And remembering that of the Chicano moratorium, a lot of the organizers went on and did other work. I mean, the Catholic Church was one thing and they did it, but they got Cardinal McIntyre to retire. And that was something that nobody thought would ever happen, at least not immediately after Católicos does what they do. And I think they're also one of these groups that is just, they're a flash in the pan. They didn't do much. They're not that significant. And I think we need to give them more credit.
So what's fascinating about the work that you are presenting to the world is that these movements around the church helped pull together a profoundly multi-ethnic cohort of revolutionaries, Black Americans, Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, all of whom were presenting demands to the church and forcing the church to live up to its lofty ideals and to essentially live and walk the life of Jesus, of the revolutionary Jesus.
Exactly.
Who said that it is easier for a needle to a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God.
Exactly. And here's the thing that surprised me every step of the way. I think we tend to sort of bifurcate and sort of think about radical politics and reformist politics as sort of somehow reformist politics took a backseat to radical politics of Black or brown power, whichever sort of avenue we're going there. And I think, and as I learned from the work that you've done, these folks were savvy. They were smart. They knew what they were doing. One of the things that you write about is that these were people that respected their elders. These were folks that knew what it was going to take to win the confidence and the trust of the community. And I think for the most part, they get represented as irresponsible criminals or people that were calling on for violence. And that gets all of the attention. And we miss out on the brilliance of that kind of community organizing that was taking place. And to have churches at the center of that, for me, was like, well, you know,
you died and went to heaven.
If nobody's gonna do this, I'm gonna run with it. And I'm gonna tell this story, and You know, it had to be told in a way that was not just what happened in New York. Although I think the Chicago book, the Chicago chapter could have been an entire book, to be honest. That was the one, that was the one chapter that I thought I could keep going here.
Wow.
And it could be an entire, chapter. But, you know, I got to meet Obed Lopez and his brother Omar. I had breakfast with them in their home, did a great
And who
interview.
are they? Can you tell us who they are?
Yeah, so Obed and Omar are brothers. They were Mexican immigrants. They came to the U.S. in their teenage years. Trying to remember, I don't remember exactly from where in Mexico. But
Mexico City. Obed was, I think, active
in
Mexico City.
Yeah, and these were folks that had been influenced and shaped by not only the politics of the Mexican Revolution, but also the Cuban Revolution, especially Obed. And they become part of, they're living in the neighborhood where there are predominantly Puerto Rican communities, and they join these struggles and they join these movements. And Obed starts another organization called LADO, the Latin American Defense Organization, which is really a takeoff from the Spanish American Committee, which in Chicago, which Obed thought was too narrow and too parochial, right? Too sort of centered on Puerto Ricans, and he wanted a sort of a broader, kind of more coalition building thing. Obed is the one that Chacha and the Young Lords send to San Antonio to go and negotiate with the Presbyterians.
I'm looking.
Anyway, I could go on. And Houston, I mean, you talk about Houston. I mean, it's all in the book, but it's a story that I think it's a story that comes out of not only the Puerto Rican movement or the Chicano movement, but I'm trying really, really hard, Professor, to try to make a case for how we think about and draft and narrativize what's the story of a Latino freedom movement, and what does that mean, you know?
Right.
And I don't push it. I'm not there to sort of make all these claims about, you know, all this kind of interethnic coalition building. These are very specific movements bounded by the Barrio. I mean, that's why Barrio's in the title, because I think Chicano history and Puerto Rican history are rooted and begin in that story of the Barrio. And if the Barrio is the main story, then displacement is it. It's what happens and what has happened to us, not only in the Barrios, but in Latin America and where we've come from.
Right.
Migration has been a big part of it.
Absolutely. Multiple displacements.
I think of Virginia Sanchez Corro's work, Al Camarillo. Everything seems to be rooted in the Barrio and how people sort of recreated these spaces, but it comes out of this experience of displacement first and foremost. So I start there. I have a subheading is displacement as prologue. I mean, it's where we need to start.
Right. And I make those arguments as well in my chapter 1 and 2. So part of what you've heard, our listening audience, is that Dr. Hinojosa is trying to understand what the Latino freedom movement looked like in the 60s as a means of understanding what it might look like today, but also to integrate the history of the 60s, which is told in black and white.
Yeah.
But the actors were profoundly diverse. And I wanted to go back to Obed Lopez, because Obed Lopez was a normalista. I write about this in my book on page 34. He was part of the normalistas. They were the people, the teachers in Mexico, who organized in the 1950s and let the groundwork for the student movements of the 1960s in Mexico that ended with a massacre of Mexican students in 1968. It's a famous moment in Mexican history, in the history of the 60s and 1968, the movements and uprisings of 1968. And Obed Lopez, who organized Mexicans and Puerto Ricans, but also Black Americans in Chicago, had gained all of this organizing experience from being active in Mexico in a previous period. And he, of course, was also influenced by the Cuban Revolution. Yeah. And what he brought to politics in Chicago, in part, was a strong class analysis of oppression. That you can't only talk about race and ethnicity. You have to also talk about class and class oppression. And both are actually intertwined. And those were the politics of Lado. And Lado therefore argued that if class is central and we need to look at the root causes of social problems, we can't organize as Puerto Ricans alone, or Mexicans alone, or African Americans alone. We need to come together.
And they were both raised in a Protestant family, in a very conservative Protestant
Really?
family. Yes, both of them. Yeah, the Lopez brothers.
Listen, I didn't interview Obed, but I interviewed his brother,
Omar.
And it was one of the best interviews. Yeah, he's, you know, amazing human beings, radicals and activists.
They were so gracious to me. I mean, they didn't have to, you know, welcome me in the way that they did. I mean, I was nobody and am nobody, you know, in terms of the kind of stuff that I'm a nobody. And so to be able to show up at
you
their
are
home,
somebody. What you talking about?
Well, but to be able to show up at their home and the beautiful spread that they had, we spent a beautiful morning there. You know, those were a gift. And I think there's just a lot of work that we still need to do in this Latino freedom movement, whether we're talking biographies of people like Obed, or other folks. But I just, you know, I mean, yes, there's a lot that's been written on Chicago, but there's a lot that's been written on LA. People keep writing on LA. You know, I mean, you know, there's always more there that we could probe and understand. And, you know, I think the challenge ahead in terms of defining this field and what we do in terms of talking about the freedom movement is pretty significant and pretty important in terms of what's left. And so I'm excited to be a part of that and just to kind of contribute a small part of that.
So let's wrap up this conversation because it's now 9:27 my time, and I got to wake up early tomorrow.
And by the way, you and we could
talk forever. Don't start with us because we'll be here till 3:00 in the morning talking the literature of, you know, history in the 1960s. What do you want to leave our listening audience with? Tell us first the title of your book again. But by the way, guys, this is going to be an award-winning book. And this book is going to add texture and complexity to the history of Latinos, because the contradiction is that religion is intertwined with Latino life, but religion is absent from the histories and studies in the field of Latino studies. So in many ways, Latino studies does not reflect the lived experience of Latinos and Latinx people in America, because they're a religious people. So you're bringing that not only to Latino life, but to the social movements.
Yeah.
That's like a triple, quadruple, you know, punch. That you are bringing the significance of religion to the civil rights and Black Power movements and Black and Brown Power movements of the 1960s. It's brilliant, really, truly. So what do you want to leave our listening audience with? Tell us the title of your book again.
The title of the book is Apostles of Change, Latino Radical Politics, Church Occupations, and the Fight to Save the Barrio.
Guys, wait, hold on. In the academy, we're Latinos, right? I'm Black, but I'm still Latino. Latinos haven't really established a firm foundation in the academy. So oftentimes, it's assumed that we can't read and write. But both of us were English majors in order to learn how to read and write and beat the best of them at their craft.
By the way, I love that. I love that we had that. I didn't know that.
So let me tell you, I spent a lifetime writing my book, and it is well written.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to say that because it didn't come naturally. I worked on it, and I've been perfecting my craft for a minute. And of course, the story is so inspiring, and I was driven by the inspiration of the story of the Young Lords, the Puerto Rican counterpart of the Black Panther Party. But when I read this man's chapter on the Young Lords, I was like, oh snap, this man can write. He wrote his ass off. So this is a book that you are going to enjoy reading. It's not going to be one of those academic books that you can't make heads or tails out of it. It is beautifully written, and it is clear. And the thing is, when there is gobbledygook in the academy and in the books that academics write, it's because there's no clarity in terms of what you're arguing and what the greater meaning of the work is. In any case, this man's writing is phenomenal.
Thank you so much. And believe me that your help in connecting me with Hiram Maristani to get the pictures that I needed to get.
He was the resident photographer of the Young Lords.
Because let me tell you, if I had sent him an email, first of all, when I first reached out, he's like, how did you get my email? Number one, okay? And when I told him that I knew you, that opened the door. And so without you making that possible, and without having your book, without having this, the Young Lords, right next to, as I'm writing the chapter of the First Spanish United Methodist Church, I miss the significant details that made that occupation such an important one. And so your contribution here has been with me. Even before we met, I was admiring your work from a distance. So there's no question about that. I think that what I want people to know and to remember, or to sort of think more critically about, are two things. The first is we have to sort of understand that the relevance and the importance of the Latino freedom movement stretched in places that we haven't even imagined or fully comprehended or thought of. What we see as either a farm worker movement in Delano, or the Young Lords in Chicago or New York City, is much more expansive, much deeper, much more profound than we have ever sort of even begun to think about. And I think the work that has been done has led us to a point where we need to begin to ask those deeper questions. Organizers and activists like Obed Lopez and others. The second thing is a point that comes through very clearly in your book, and that is that we were building coalitions. Our folk was joining with other people. This was about class as much as it was about race. I learned that in reading your work. How can you have a movement fixated on race when in Chicago, Chacha Jimenez...
We lost you, sir.
Oh.
Okay,
am I
how
there?
can you have a movement fixated on race?
Right. When in Chicago, Chacha Jimenez is very light-skinned. And what makes the Puerto Rican community and the Chicano community is that sort of, difference in color, light-skinned to darker-skinned and all of that. And so bringing in a class component, the critique of capitalism, the anti-racist movement, the building of coalitions, all of these things are central to how we're going to understand the Latino freedom movement in the years to come. And I think your book has laid that foundation, and people like me are trying to catch up as much as we can to try to tell our corner of that story. So
I have a question here from Patricia Polanco, which is, if you had to say one thing, if these movements should be remembered for one thing, what should it be? I think you might have said it at the start. It might be the thesis of your book, but I'll let you. I won't lead the witness.
I think I came away amazed in writing the first book at how Chicanos in a small town in Mathis, Texas, just outside of Corpus, had organized with Puerto Ricans in East Harlem. Farm workers in South Texas had done this. I think if I were to point to one thing, that coalition building, that reaching out, that learning and taking from each other. I mean, in Houston, Gregory Salazar from the Mexican American Youth Organization takes a bus trip to go to the SDS conference, I think in '68, if I have my years.
Students for a Democratic Society.
And he meets Fred Hampton.
One of the major organizations of the 60s.
He meets Fred Hampton and he meets Chacha Jimenez. And it revolutionizes his life. It changes his life. Those travels, those movements are significant. I think they're representative of our own sort of migration experience. But I think it's the one thing that I think about in terms of how we sort of tell these stories that are rooted in the barrio, but that tell these larger national and transnational, stories. It starts in the barrio, but it certainly doesn't stay there.
And by the way, Fred Hampton was the leader of the Chicago chapter of the Black Panther Party, and he was the founder of the Rainbow Coalition, a coalition of Puerto Ricans, Mexicans, Black Americans, but also poor whites from Appalachia, coming together on the basis of a shared class interest. Felipe, you're my comrade, my brother, and my colleague. And I wish you tremendous success with this book. Folks need to pick up this book. You've heard it for the first time here, but by the way, when it, when
40% off. There's a link in my bio to 40% off. So I think right now is the time to buy it for sure.
So 40% off in his bio. His name is on Instagram at South Texas Forever. I'm like, who is this man? At South Texas Forever. Who is this man? That's Dr. Felipe Hinojosa. Thank you so very much for your work. It's a tremendous contribution, and hopefully it'll illuminate a new generation of organizers and radicals and revolutionaries in this period.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. And thank you for your work that opened the door for me to be able to do what I wanted to do. I mean, I remember, and I think I told you this, and we had a good laugh about it, but I was in your city. I was in New York City in 2015 as a kid, not knowing anybody, going to these museums and trying to learn as much. I went to the Schomburg, did research in there. I think, and New York City is not such a distant place. I mean, when I was growing up in my church, we all saw The Cross and the Switchblade, that Nicky Cruz and Pat Boone 1970 film about this white evangelical trying to save Black and brown young people in New York City. That's always been in my consciousness, and to be able to be in that city, to see now the work that the First Spanish United Methodist Church continues to do in this pandemic is inspiring. I love it. I'm humbled by it. I am to a T a very emotional person. There were many times in the archives and in writing when I would get emotional and inspired at the same time. So, and in reading your book and being able to then say, as all good historians should do, lay a framework and a pathway so that others who come after you can also do this work and take it in different directions. That's exactly what you've done. I'm eternally grateful. Thank you so much.
I don't even know what to say, because we were really writing at the same time. But,
well, we were, but believe me, I was stalking you from a distance before, I'm downloading everything, and I taught my first class on the occupations probably in 2015 or 16. And the students got a healthy dose of Johanna Fernández and others that have written on Chicago, especially. So you opened that possibility. And the way that you talk about the church, especially the way that you did it, and you came through here, but the way that you did it in that museum book,
right.
As kind of launching the New Yorican Poets Cafe in the Lower East Side. Like, this was the space where people were reading poetry. They were you know, they finally had a space where they could do these things, and that leads to other things. I wasn't even thinking about that sort of aspect of it, and you opened up the door for us to think about that. And so,
the
yeah,
sanctuary at the church in these movements became the site of big dreams.
Yeah, big dreams. And I look forward to saying, hey, we just started. How are we going to tell this story? How are we going to narrativize this idea, this movement, in a way that's going to inspire people, not only in the United States or in East Harlem or in South Texas, but all over the globe?
You are an emotional person, and so am I.
I am.
Like I pretend to be like strong, but I got that. You know, it's emotional work. It's emotional work. It's hard work. And you left a piece of your soul in that book.
I did.
You want to give us some final words on that, so that you have the last word?
I just do it as a love letter to my parents. And we started talking about my family and my parents here in this conversation. You know, I talk to them every day. I got them an iPhone so that we could FaceTime in the midst of this pandemic. They're very conservative. We don't agree on everything theologically or politically, but we do agree on the fact that we need to take care of each other and love one another and look out for the least of
these. And look out for the least of these.
As it says clearly. Yeah, look out for the least of these, as it says clearly in the Bible. And I thank my parents for instilling that in me, and I carry that. I mean, my mom wishes that I would be a preacher right now, a pastor. But I tell my mom, I'm like, I'm on a different beat. I'm doing something different, but I'm still committed to making sure that people understand that we have to look out for each other. We have to take care of each other, especially in these moments. And I hope, I see my book too as kind of that, like, people taking care of each other. I mean, Obed Lopez talks about the occupation of the seminary, of McCormick Seminary in Chicago, as an action of love. And I love that. I love that. So I hope that people feel that and move forward, because academia is a cold place, and I'm happy to defy all of that and try to bring some love and some soul into that.
My listening audience, you've been listening to the voice of Dr. Felipe Hinojosa, the author of the brilliant new book, Apostles of Change, Latino Radical Politics, Church Occupations, and the Fight to Save the Barrio. And he is a brilliant professor, and it's important for us to inform his parents that in being a professor, he is also a frustrated preacher.
Thank you. My mother will appreciate that.
So,
my mother will appreciate that.
Señora Hinojosa, no se preocupe, que eso, it's in the cards.
It's in the cards. It's who we are. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Profesora Fernández. Thank you. I yearn for the day. I dream of the day when we can come together again and see each other in person and laugh out loud.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to going to McDonald's with you in the middle of the night to get chicken McNuggets.
That's going to be forever our story, for sure. Thank you so much for tonight. This was great. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Yours is a beautiful story. Thank you for inspiring us.
Thank you for giving me this platform and for asking such great questions. How are you so good at this? This is ridiculous. That's not even fair.
We spent 20 years doing oral histories. You're good at it too.
Oh my gosh. Well, thank you. Thank you.
Good night, everybody. Thank you for
Okay, good night, everybody. All right.